You are listening to a London Review of Books podcast.
3rd of January 2012, Yorkshire. En route to Leeds, we have lunch at Betty's in Ilkley, packed with people stir-crazy after the holiday. We're sitting facing the car park and the row of shops beyond. Me. What is that shop called? Rupert. Which? Me. It looks to me like hot faeces. Rupert. It's Fat Face. Between a shop calling itself Fat Face and one called Hot Faeces seems a difference of degree only, with both equally mysterious. Is it a shop where one gets a fat face, hence sweets and confectionery, or an outside shop? Neither, apparently, just a well-known fashion outlet. Still, the name seems quite odd to me, if not nearly as unlikely as what I thought it was. Keep up, I suppose, the message. 24th of January. Well, love, the call's going on, is what my mother used to say in the early 1960s when I phoned from London, meaning that telephoning to them was still a luxury. On the rare occasions when I was at home and wanted to make a private call, it had to be on the shop phone, which was mounted on the wall with a separate mouth and earpiece. So some of one's intimate moments were played out amid sawdust and blood. 2nd of February. An environmentally sensitive bus is named after me in Leeds. I just wish it could have been a tram. 25th of April. At 5, a car comes to take me down to Silk Studios on Berwick Street to record a voiceover of my own voice for an episode of Family Guy, the story being that Brian, the dog, has written a play premiering at Quayhog, which all the playwrights, that is Yasmina Reza, David Mamet and me, duly go and see, and rubbish. They'd first of all asked if they could use me as a cartoon character, to which I graciously agreed, not saying that I felt it was the highlight of my career. It was then they asked if I would voice myself. Yasmina and David had apparently not been tempted, but I went for this too, and it was only as I was signing the clearance afterwards that I realised Family Guy is a Fox, i.e. a Murdoch programme, and so not something I would normally do. Today was the day Murdoch Senior was on the stand at the Leveson inquiry, and en route to the studio I asked the driver who has been his most famous passenger. Without hesitation he says Muhammad Ali, but then reels off a list of other celebrities he had driven, including the Murdochs. I take this just to be the driver keeping in the swim, but a few minutes later the car phone rings with the message, "Car for Mr. Murdoch at 8:30. Which Murdoch it is I don't ask, though feel myself faintly brushed by the wings of history. The driver, incidentally, is the first person I've spoken to who is actually looking forward to the Olympics. 23rd of May. A party for Her Majesty the Queen at the Royal Academy, where, around 6, we join a straggling queue of notables, the actors the most obvious, though Vivienne Westwood is her usual unobtrusive self. Talk to various people in the queue, one of whom seems to know my plays well, but then congratulates me on my paintings of trees. She's the first of 3 people who confuse me with Hockney, and though he too is at the party, I doubt if he is similarly confused with me. Inside, the place is less crowded than one had expected, and with the room so tall it's almost airy. We are directed into one of the emptier rooms where HMQ is due to pass through, but are then pounced on by some young man who asks if he may introduce a slightly bewildered Duke of Kent. We have an awkward few minutes, but the day is saved by Clive Swift, whose son Joe has just won a medal at Chelsea. His Royal Highness knows about Chelsea, and so brightens considerably. Meanwhile, lurking by the door the Queen is due to come through is Kate O'Mara, and when I next look, lining up to meet Her Majesty are Ms. O'Mara, along with Joan Collins and Shirley Bassey, the impression being that anyone can get to speak to the monarch, provided you're pushy enough. But it's all very casual, so much so that Rupert doesn't even see the Queen, though she's distinctive enough, dressed in white and glittering with jewels, determinedly animated and smiling, which, since she's been at it for 2 hours already, is an achievement in itself. We go on through the rooms, talking to all sorts of people, Jim Naughty, Nigel Slater and David Hare, who claims that the best conjunction he's seen so far is George Steiner talking to Joan Collins. Come away at 8 o'clock, with HMQ still at it, and the policeman in the forecourt very jolly and eating ice cream. 1st of June. John Horder dies at 92, who, after a succession of bad doctors at university and in New York, was the physician who restored my faith in the medical profession. It was partly because he listened, as doctors have learnt to do since, I hope, but which in the early 1960s they hardly did at all. Kind and in some respects saintly, his care for his patients brought on regular breakdowns, and he was no stranger to depression. Famous as Sylvia Plath's doctor, he always reproached himself that he did not see her suicide coming. What he thought of Ted Hughes is not recorded. Once, examining, as he was often called on to do, my back passage, he said, "No, I can't find anything that concerns me here, but," and his finger all the while up my bum, "it's always nice to see you." 27th of July. A flying visit to Norfolk, where I'm to read at the Holt Festival. Rather than hang about all morning, Rupert sensibly gets us off to look at 2 churches at Warham, both medieval but with one done up in the 18th century. As we look round the first church, which has 3 fonts, there is some sort of exercise going on in the air, with planes filling both sky and church with thunderous noise. The Olympics, Rupert suggests, that unlonged-for day having at last arrived. Not particularly memorable, one church does have a noteworthy memorial. Richard Henry Burden Cattle, M.A., Rector of the Warhams, 1928 to 1947, Captain of the English rugby football team, 1900, Chaplain to the forces at Gallipoli, 1915. This tablet is placed here in remembrance by his 7 daughters. It's a novel by Ivy Compton Bennett. 4th of August. I thought I would list the various names people have for me. In the local post office, where I go every morning for the papers, I am Mr. Allen, though Zyman, with his film star looks, just calls me Alan and occasionally pats my arm. The English lady from Kent in Shepherd Foods, who wears a burqa, calls me Mr. Bennett, and because it's the way she's been brought up, and I'm older than she is, won't say Alan. My mother would give me a clip. In the coffee shop across the road, where I get my daily decaf latte, it's Sir, though one of the several discussion groups outside refers to me as that man, as in, hello, that man, which has an undertone of the parade ground to it. In the greengrocer's I'm Mr. B, and to the elegant lady who used to own it and who's lived round here longer than I have, my dear. To Sam Frears lower down the road I'm just Bennett, and when I occasionally see another neighbour, Dom Cooper, I'm called out to as A.B., which is what he and the other history boys called me. At the stage door of the National, I am young man, which reminds me that the doorman of Durrant's Hotel once called Alec Guinness young man, thereby forfeiting his tip, though he might have expected to have it doubled. Our fair-haired bin man always bellows, "Alan," above the noise of the rotor. "Still on your bike?" I'm grateful to be so generally greeted, and put it down to having that kind of face, as my dad was the same. Still, I doubt anyone ever said to him, "Hello, you old cunt," as is occasionally said to me. 20th of October. Another speaking engagement, this time at Settle High School, which is just down the road, to raise funds for their newly opened library. As usual, I follow my reading with a question and answer, the first question being, "Mr. Bennett, in the light of the Jimmy Savile revelations, will you be changing the plot of the History Boys?" "No, of course not," is the answer, though the supposed parallels had not occurred to me. I point out that Hector's fumblings with his pupils are inept, to say the least, and that the boys are all 17 or 18 and far more sexually sophisticated than Hector, who is in many ways an innocent. The notion that the plot of a play should be modified in the light of subsequent events is also an odd one. 16th of October. The 50th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which at the time I never expected to live to see. We were in America with Beyond the Fringe, the first hint of trouble coming when we were playing Washington. Some of the younger members of the Kennedy administration took us along to the press conference at the White House when the existence of the launch sites was first revealed. I remember nothing of that, struck only by how glamorous Kennedy was, how swiftly he came to the podium, and how he flirted with the women journalists. I had never seen such charm. By the time we got to New York with the show, the crisis had hotted up, with all four of us just wishing we were back at home. Not that that would have done us any good. We also stayed together most of the day, with Peter Cook always avid for news, following each new development and often on the phone to London. On the crucial night, as it was thought, I stayed with Dudley Moore in his Midtown apartment. This he later embellished for chat show consumption as my having hidden under his bed, which, since it was seldom unoccupied and often the scene of tumultuous activity, would hardly have been a sensible precaution. By the opening night, it was thought the crisis had passed, whereas in fact it was just coming to a head. A siren went off in the middle of the show, and dead silence ensued. But it was only a fire engine, and the relief meant the audience laughed even more. None of this, though, was as memorable as after the assassination the following year, when on Thanksgiving I remember walking through a Manhattan that was empty and wholly silent. 11th of November. T.S. Eliot I only saw once, sometime in 1964. He was on the old Central Station in Leeds, long since demolished, which was the terminus for the London trains. I was with Timothy Binion, with whom I'd been at college and who, in 1964, was a lecturer in Russian at Leeds University, and was also teaching me to drive. In the early 1960s, there had been a long overdue attempt to reactivate the slot machines which all through the war years and after had stood empty and disconsolate on railway platforms, a sad reminder of what life had been like before the war. Now, briefly, there was chocolate in the machines again, and cigarettes too. It had taken 20 years, but austerity was now seemingly at an end. One beneficiary of this development was a rudimentary printing machine to be found on most mainline stations. Painted pillar-box red, it was a square console on legs with a dial on the top and a pointer. Using this pointer, and for sixpence or a shilling, one could spell out one's name and address, which would then be printed onto a strip of aluminium foil, which could be attached to one's suitcase, kit bag or whatever. Astonished to find such a machine actually working after decades of disuse, Binion and I were printing out our names, watched by a friendly middle-aged woman who was equally fascinated. It was at this point the train came in, and after most of the passengers had cleared, there came a small procession, headed by the friendly lady, whom I now recognised as Mrs. Fletcher, a customer at my father's butcher's shop, followed by her daughter Valerie, pushing a wheelchair with, under a pile of rugs, her husband T.S. Eliot, all accompanied by a flotilla of porters. It was only when this cavalcade had passed that the person we were waiting for made her appearance, namely the current editor of the London Review of Books, who at that time worked for Faber and Faber, and whose titular boss T.S. Eliot had been. T.S. Eliot died early the following year. Timothy Binion, having produced a definitive biography of Pushkin, died in 2004, and now Valerie Eliot has died. I only met her a couple of times, though was persuaded to attend her funeral, if only because, through her family coming to our shop, I had known her longest, if in some respects least. She used to claim that she remembered me as a boy doing my homework in a corner of the shop, an unlikely recollection and a slightly distasteful one, reminiscent of Millet's fairly odious picture of Christ in the carpenter's shop. Had I ever chosen to do my homework in the shop, it would have got short shrift from my father, who would have seen it as showing off. What Valerie Eliot did do, though, was to send me the notes her husband had made on the inside of his programme after their visit to Beyond the Fringe. An amazingly vigorous quartet of young men, their show well-produced and fast-moving, a mixture of brilliance, juvenility, and bad taste. Brilliance illustrated by a speech by Macmillan, Cook, a sermon, Bennett, and an interview with an African politician, Miller, who otherwise reminded us of Auden. Juvenility by anti-nuclear bomb scene, anti-capital punishment scene, and the absence of any satire at the expense of the Labour Party. Bad taste by armpits and Lady Astor speech. Still, it is pleasant to see this type of entertainment so successful.
Thanks for listening. For more, go to lrb.co.uk.